Good morning, it's Monday the 22nd of August and welcome to our Monday morning roundup of the week's key economic highlights brought to you by Atlantic Capital Markets. As always, we'll start with a quick rundown of the key economic numbers being issued this week and we'll then dive into some of the more important stories afterwards with our own thoughts and analysis. So without further ado, let's get straight to it. So the economic numbers being issued this week start today, where it's interest rate decision day in China, plus the release of the manufacturing and services PMIs in Australia. On Tuesday, it's also a big day for PMI releases for the eurozone, Germany, the UK and the US. We'll give our thoughts on all of these straight after this. Also on Tuesday, the eurozone's consumer confidence figures and new home sales in the US. On Wednesday, we'll hear the release of the latest US durable goods figures, the US pending orders, EIA crude oil inventories and retail sales in New Zealand. Thursday sees the release of the minutes from the last ECB meeting, and Thursday also sees several key figures meeting up for the annual Jackson Hole Symposium over in Wyoming. Both stories that we'll discuss in more detail afterwards. Thursday also sees the release of the latest US GDP figures, which we'll also take a look at in more detail afterwards. Finally for Thursday, the release of GDP in Germany, the IFO business climate also in Germany, and the initial jobless claims in the US. And finally on Friday, the US release their latest PCE figures, which we'll take a look at towards the end of today's video. The Jackson Hole Symposium continues for its second day, and we'll also hear the latest German GfK consumer confidence numbers and the Michigan consumer confidence as well. And the companies that we'll hear trading updates from this week start today with Zoom, who released their Q2s. We'll talk about those in more detail in a moment. Tuesday sees the release of John Wood Group and Macy's. On Wednesday, Nvidia released their Q2 results, and we'll give our thoughts on this in a moment. Also on Wednesday, Salesforce and Snowflake. And finally on Thursday, Hays released their preliminary results for the year, and Peloton released their Q4s as well, both of which we'll discuss in more detail later in today's video. Thursday also brings results from CRH, Dell, Dollar General and Gap. Well, anyone hoping for quiet summer trading will have been disappointed this summer. There has been decent volatility as the markets weigh up central bank expectations. Last week saw the market once again price in a more aggressive Fed, lifting the US dollar, which came following the previous week when cooler inflation data saw aggressive Fed bets ease. Well, this week central banks will remain in focus with whatever nuggets of information that can be gleaned from the Federal Reserve's Jackson Hole Symposium, and of course the release of the latest ECB minutes, in addition to US PCE inflation data. So let's look at some of those stories in more detail. Well, today, online video conference host Zoom are due to release their Q2 results. Zoom, the pandemic darling, dropped to a two-year low in May at under $80 before rebounding over $100 after Q1 revenues rose 12% year-on-year to $1.07 billion. Competition from rivals such as Microsoft Teams and Skype, in addition to the return to office post-pandemic, saw the share price drop 80% from the 2020 high reached at the height of the pandemic. In Q2, Zoom said that it expects revenues of $1.12 billion with profits of 90 cents per share. Management also raised full-year revenue guidance to $4.55 billion with full-year profits of $3.70 and $3.77 a share. Tuesday sees the release of European PMI data. Well, the European economy did manage to grow in the second quarter. However, the third quarter is looking less upbeat. The composite PMIs fell below 50 in June, the level which separates expansion from contraction, fueling recession fears. As prices continue to rise, the index, which gauges business activity, fell to 49.9. In Germany, the composite PMI dropped further to 48.1. The preliminary reading for July is expected to show business activity in the eurozone drop to 48.8 and in Germany to 47.4. A deeper decline in PMI figures for August could cement recession fears, hitting demand for the euro and potentially pulling the DAX off its two-month high. Wednesday sees the release of Q2 earnings from chipmaker Nvidia, which comes as the share price has halved from November's high. Preliminary numbers showed that revenue would be just $6.7 billion. That's compared to its previous estimate of $8.1 billion. The downward revision comes after peer Micron Technologies warned over a challenging market and slowing PC sales. At Nvidia, the gaming business is not in great shape. Its gaming revenue is reported at $2.04 billion, a 33% decline from the previous year's $3.06 billion. The results showed a rollback towards 2020 consumer habits when gaming brought in revenues of $1.65 billion. On Thursday, Hays plc are due to release their preliminary results for the year. Now, recruitment firms such as Hays typically perform well in times of economic growth and lag in times of economic uncertainty. Recession fears have been ramping up in the UK, but even so, Hays managed to report record quarterly growth in net fees, up 24%. Costs will be in focus too as the recruiter continues increasing its headcount. However, productivity has reportedly remained strong. Investors will be keen to see what those record fees mean in terms of shareholder returns. Peloton are also due to release their Q4 results on Thursday, which come as the share price has risen 30% to over $12 in the past month, rebounding from a record low hit in July. The price is also down 88% over the past year after the pandemic play slowed. The firm reported a dire performance in Q2, cutting its full-year revenue estimates to $3.7 to $3.8 billion. That's down significantly from the $5.4 billion initially guided for. In Q3, Peloton reported Q3 revenues of $964.3 million, which is expected to fall again to $675 to $700 million in Q4, and EBITDA losses of $115 to $120 million. A build-up of inventory as demand slowed resulted in Peloton cutting prices by around 30%. However, Peloton has since reversed the price cut and announced that 800 jobs would go, as well as outsourcing deliveries. Given the rising cost of living crisis, the price rise does seem somewhat out of touch, given that consumers are spending less on discretionary items. Well, the minutes of the July ECB meeting will be released on Thursday as well, and this was the meeting where the central bank lifted rates for the first time in over a decade and did so by 50 basis points, twice what the market was actually expecting. So with inflation at a record high of 8.9% in July and still rising, investors will scrutinise the minutes closely for clues as to how the ECB intends to bring inflation back to 2% as the economy almost certainly heads into recession. The question is, will the ECB look to raise rates by 50 basis points again in September? Well, it's also the start of the two-day Jackson Hole Symposium on Thursday. The Federal Reserve's annual symposium held in Wyoming will be attended by central bankers and policymakers. And this year, the title of the forum is Reassessing Constraints of the Economy and Policy. We could see the Federal Reserve fire another hawkish shot across the market. Fed Chair Powell's principal focus is expected to be the importance of bringing inflation back down. However, it will be interesting to see whether the Fed or other central banks are concerned about over-tightening monetary policy. Any sense of a more hawkish pivot could help stocks extend their recent rally and the USD fall lower. And finally, on Thursday, the US released their latest GDP figures. Well, the US has recorded 2 straight quarters of negative GDP growth, which means it is technically in a recession. Well, in the first 3 months of the year, the economy fell 1.6% annually. Q2, the initial reading showed that the economy contracted 0.9%. Well, no significant change is expected for the second reading. While falling inventories were to blame for slowing growth, personal consumption rose by 1%, most likely supported by the upbeat jobs market. And finally, on Friday, the Fed's preferred gauge for inflation, the personal consumption expenditure, sees the release of its latest figures. The PCE hit a new 40-year high in June of 6.8%. Core PCE increased 4.8% year on year, but since then the CPI measure of inflation, which was also at a 40-year high, cooled by more than expected. So the markets will be watching closely to see if this is mirrored in the PCE inflation reading. This reading could be crucial in determining whether the Fed will raise interest rates by 0.5% to 0.75% in the September meeting. Currently, the market is favouring a half-point hike, although this remains a very close call. Cooling PCE could help boost stocks and gold and pull the US dollar lower. So those were the big stories of the week. Let's wrap up with a quick look at the dividend announcement due out this week. In the FTSE 100, we'll hear from Phoenix Group, Mondi, NatWest, St James's Place, Diageo, Landsec and Auto Trader. In the FTSE 250, we'll hear from Personal Assets Trust, HICL Infrastructure, Drax, FDM Group, RHI and Magnesita, Capital & Counties, Biffa, Contour Global and Witan Investment Trust. So there you have it. All eyes this week will really be on the annual shindig in Wyoming to get even a hint of where policymakers' minds will be in the US looking forward. Recessionary winds are blowing across the Atlantic, but don't worry, we're here as always at Atlantic Capital Markets just to keep your feet firmly planted on terra firma. So as always, thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to click on that subscribe button to make sure that you don't miss out on our regular financial updates with our very own expert market analysis and opinions. Also, if you haven't tried it already, why not download our app to your phone or tablet if you do want to keep updated on the latest financial news, as well, of course, as our award-winning trading signals. So until next time, from all of us here at Atlantic Capital Markets, have yourself a great week.